The diplomatic station hung in the darkness of space like a silver pearl, its observation decks reflecting the distant light of a red giant star. Commander Sarah Chun stood at the viewport, her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she watched the Valerian warship descend toward the docking bay. She had served in the Earth Defense Force for 32 years, and in those 3 decades, she had learned to read situations the way ancient sailors read the wind. The Valorians were a proud species, known across the galaxy for their advanced technology and their absolute certainty in their own superiority. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, their silver skin gleaming like polished metal, and they carried themselves with the arrogance of beings who had never tasted defeat. In the past 20 years since humanity made first contact, the Valorians had made it clear that they viewed humans as interesting anomalies, nothing more than curious creatures barely worth a second glance. Sarah had been chosen to represent humanity at this summit because she was everything the Valorians respected: decisive, calm, and undeniably competent. What they didn't know was that her composure masked decades of hard-won experience earned in ways that would have horrified their sheltered nobility. The docking procedures completed smoothly, and soon Sarah found herself in the main conference chamber, a vast circular room with transparent walls showing the infinite expanse of space beyond. The Valerian delegation entered with characteristic precision, their movements synchronized and purposeful. At the center of their formation walked a figure that made even the other Valorians seem ordinary. Princess Audria was the Valerian royalty, heir to the entire Valerian collective. She moved with an almost liquid grace, her silver skin tinged with subtle blue markings that denoted her royal bloodline. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. She wore a form-fitting suit of what appeared to be living armor, its surface rippling with soft iridescence. Behind her walked her personal guards, each one standing a head taller than Sarah and radiating contained violence. Sarah rose from her seat as protocol demanded. She extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, her face a perfect mask of diplomatic neutrality. "Your Highness, we are honored by your presence." The princess looked at Sarah's extended hand the way one might regard an insect. After a moment of deliberate silence, she allowed the briefest contact, her grip cool and possessing no warmth whatsoever. "Commander Chun," she said, her voice carrying the harmonious tones of the Valerian language, translated by the neural interface Sarah wore. "I must admit, the reports about your species are entertaining." They settled around the negotiation table, and Sarah noticed that the princess never took her eyes off her. There was something predatory in that gaze, the way a cat watches a mouse before deciding whether it's worth the effort to pounce. "Your military record is quite extensive," the princess began, manipulating a holographic display that appeared before her. Images flashed across the space: combat simulations, tactical analyses, and strategic reviews. 32 years of service. Remarkable longevity for a human. "We value experience," Sarah replied carefully, already sensing where this conversation was heading. The princess smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "How many battles have you fought, Commander Chin? How many actual combat scenarios have you overseen?" Sarah had prepared for this question, though perhaps not in this context. "I've led operations in 17 major conflicts," she said quietly, "and advised on dozens more across multiple continents." There was a visible ripple of amusement through the Valerian delegation. The princess leaned back in her chair, her blue-marked fingers steepled before her face. 17 conflicts on a single planet. How quaint. She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show a star system with multiple worlds, each one marked with red symbols indicating past conflicts. The Valerian Collective has maintained order across 43 star systems. I, personally, have overseen the pacification of 9 worlds, the restructuring of 3 hostile civilizations, and the enforcement of our dominion across an entire galactic sector. The difference between our experiences, Commander, is roughly the difference between a child playing with wooden toys and a master craftsperson. Sarah felt several of her junior officers stiffen beside her. The insult was deliberate and cutting. But she had faced insults before, from opponents far more dangerous than an arrogant princess. She remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and even. "Perhaps you and I simply measure military achievement differently," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm. Humans have found that victory often comes not from the size of one's forces or the number of planets controlled, but from understanding your opponent in ways they cannot understand themselves. The princess's expression hardened. An impressive attempt at philosophy, Commander. Though I find it difficult to believe that you or your species could teach the Valerian Collective anything about warfare. We have the superior technology, superior strength, superior intellect, and superior resources. We shall see, Sarah said simply. The princess rose from her seat, drawing herself up to her full, impressive height. Indeed we shall. I came to this station hoping to find a worthy military advisor among your people, someone who might assist us in dealing with a situation that has proven unexpectedly complicated. But now I wonder if that was naive. She paused, her sharp eyes boring into Sarah's. Tell me, how many losses have you suffered in your battles? Sarah held her gaze unflinching. Enough to know that every life matters. That's what humans understand that machines and strategic calculations sometimes miss. For a moment, something flickered in the princess's eyes, not quite respect, but perhaps a hint of genuine curiosity. Then it was gone, replaced by cool dismissal. You will accompany my delegation to the Valerian Command Center tomorrow, she ordered rather than requested. We will be dealing with a situation that requires, let us call it local expertise. Perhaps watching how true military professionals operate will be educational for you. As the princess swept from the room, her guards falling into formation behind her, Sarah allowed herself the smallest smile. She had not revealed anything, had not made any grand claims, and had not attempted to compete with Valerian boasting. And yet, she had planted a seed of uncertainty in the mind of an adversary who had known only unchallenged superiority. Tomorrow, she would show the Valorians something they had never encountered before, the calculated resilience and adaptive genius of humanity. And by the time Princess Adria understood what was happening, it would be far too late to dismiss her as quaint. The Valerian command vessel was a masterpiece of engineering, a gleaming structure of crystalline materials and flowing geometric lines that somehow managed to be both beautiful and menacing. Sarah stood at the observation window as they approached the primary conflict zone, which orbited a small blue world designated Kepler 7 in the Valerian records. Below them, space was filled with sensor data, tactical readouts, and what appeared to be thousands of small contact signatures that made no conventional sense. Princess Adria stood beside her, though not quite close enough to be considered companionable. The princess had changed into more practical attire, though it was still far more ornate than anything Sarah would have chosen. Her expression had lost some of its dismissiveness and taken on a harder edge, the look of a military commander who faced an actual problem. 3 months ago, the princess began without preamble. We established a mining colony on Kepler 7. The planet is rich in valorium crystals, essential for our advanced weapons systems. The colony was staffed with 500 of our miners and engineers, protected by 200 elite military personnel. We considered it an absolute certainty of success. Sarah studied the tactical display, her trained eye already picking out inconsistencies. What happened? The planet's native inhabitants, the princess said, her jaw tightening, are a species we initially classified as primitive. Stone tools, tribal organization, no electricity. Beneath the classification of useful, we moved them from the mining region with minimal effort and minimal consideration. Sarah recognized the problem before the princess finished speaking. Underestimating an enemy was a lesson humans had learned repeatedly throughout history, often at great cost. They organized. They should not have been capable of organization, the princess snapped. Our military advantage is absolute. And yet, somehow, they have managed to isolate our colony. They have created barricades using terrain features and primitive materials that our sensors cannot properly penetrate. They have developed a communication system that uses no electronic components, making it impossible to jam. And most infuriatingly, they have been systematically disrupting our supply routes using methods that are too unpredictable for our tactical algorithms to counter. The princess gestured, and the holographic display zoomed in on the colony. Sarah could see the settlement clearly, a standard Valerian installation with rigid, geometric structures. Around it, she could see what the princess was describing, walls of stone and earth positioned at angles that seemed almost random but actually provided excellent defensive coverage. They use coordinated ambush tactics, a Valerian general explained, stepping forward. He was even larger than the princess, his skin marked with the red streaks of military rank. Small groups striking without warning, using the native flora and fauna as cover. Our soldiers are better trained and equipped, yet they suffer casualties attempting to maintain supply routes to the colony. Sarah leaned closer to the display, her mind already working through the problem. How many of the natives are there? Intelligence estimates suggest somewhere between 5 and 10,000, the princess said dismissively. Still a pittance compared to our forces, yet they possess the cunning of guerrilla operatives. There it was. Sarah saw it immediately. The Valorians had never fought this kind of war before. They were accustomed to overwhelming force applied with surgical precision against enemies that faced them directly on a field of battle. They had mastered large-scale wars, planetary conquest, and technological superiority. But they had never fought an enemy that refused to play by those rules, an enemy that understood terrain, used logistics as a weapon, and placed more value on survival than on proud displays of power. "Show me your casualty reports," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was no longer a guest but a consultant. "Detailed ones. I want to see patterns of where your soldiers died, what they were doing, the time of day, the supplies they were carrying." The Valerian general bristled slightly at her tone, but the princess gestured for him to comply. Within moments, the holographic display filled with more detailed information, marked locations representing fallen soldiers, spread across a 3-month timeline. Sarah studied them in silence for several minutes. Her officers had gathered around her now, also analyzing the data. She could feel them reaching the same conclusions she was. The native forces weren't operating randomly. They were following a strategy, a deliberate campaign designed to maximize Valerian casualties while minimizing their own losses. They were learning. "They're using adaptive tactics," one of Sarah's officers whispered. "Correct," Sarah said aloud. "They observe your response patterns, and they modify their approach accordingly. Each attack teaches them more about how you operate, what your vulnerabilities are, how your soldiers respond to specific situations." "Impossible," the general declared. "These are primitive natives. How could they possibly? Humans taught them," Sarah said quietly. The command center fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at her. "What?" the princess demanded. "You said you moved the natives from the mining region," Sarah said, turning to face the Valerian leadership. "How many of your personnel have died to accidents or illnesses since the colony was established? How many soldiers or engineers have gone missing?" The princess's expression darkened. "Several dozen, perhaps. We classified them as lost to the hazards of the mining operation, or some of them weren't lost," Sarah interrupted. "Some of them defected. Some of them are alive down there, training those natives in the principles of asymmetric warfare. Basic tactics that any species with sufficient intelligence can master when taught by someone with experience." The Valerian general clenched his fists. "Then we simply annihilate the entire population. Problem solved. And lose the mining colony in the process," Sarah said coldly. "The natives will destroy everything rather than let you have it. Plus, genocide creates a political and military nightmare across the galactic community. There will be investigations, sanctions, and most importantly, it proves that you cannot control a planet you claim to have conquered." The princess was watching Sarah now with an intensity that suggested she was beginning to reconsider her earlier dismissal. "What would you suggest, Commander Chin?" Sarah moved her hand across the holographic display, highlighting specific locations and timeline markers. "You stop treating this as a large-scale military campaign and start treating it as a psychological operation. You need to identify the humans who are down there advising the natives. You need to cut off their supply lines in the locations I'm marking. Most importantly, you need to make the natives understand that continuing this resistance benefits them more than fighting back." "Negotiate with primitives?" the general scoffed. "We are Valorians. We do not bargain from positions of weakness." "You're not in a position of strength either," Sarah replied. "Not here. That's what you're struggling to understand. This isn't about your technology anymore. It's about will, adaptation, and understanding your opponent. And that's something humans have spent millennia perfecting." The princess studied the tactical modifications Sarah had outlined. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "I will provide you with full access to all our intelligence and personnel records. You will develop a comprehensive strategy to end this conflict. With human advisors from my team, Sarah added. The princess nodded slowly. With human advisors. As Sarah turned back to the display, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The Valorians had finally asked the right question. Not how many battles she had fought, but how she would solve one that had them stumped. Sarah stood in the underground operations center beneath the Valerian colony, studying the communication logs that had been intercepted over the past 3 months. Around her, Valerian intelligence officers moved with methodical precision, but their faces carried the frustration of individuals chasing shadows. Sarah's human team, meanwhile, moved with a different kind of energy. They were connecting dots, seeing patterns that the Valerian approach had overlooked. There are 4 humans down there, Lieutenant Marcus Torres announced, spreading out a file on the table before them. I've cross-referenced the missing personnel records with the patterns of tactical innovation. The sophistication of coordination suggests experienced military operatives teaching from scratch. The princess entered without fanfare, her guards remaining outside the operations center. She was beginning to understand that Sarah's methods required a different kind of space than the rigid hierarchies Valorians typically maintained. What have you discovered? Your missing personnel aren't missing, Sarah explained. They made a choice. Look at the timeline. 30 months before this colony was established, a mining survey team came to Kepler 7. One surveyor submitted a report expressing concern about the native population's intelligence levels and the ethical implications of displacement. That surveyor, she pointed to a file, was Marcus Webb, a human marine with 2 decades of combat experience against insurgent forces. Sarah pulled up another image. He saw what was coming. He recognized that your methods would create exactly this situation. So when the colony was established, he made contact with the natives. He didn't do it alone. 3 others joined him, a communications specialist, a logistics expert, and an engineer. The Valerian general who had dismissed negotiations entered the room behind the princess. His expression was murderous. Then we execute them. Simple. You can't find them, Marcus Torres said bluntly. We've been analyzing the supply caches they've been using to support the native fighters. There are 17 separate locations, and they move between them using routes that exploit the forest coverage. Your sensors can't track them because they move at night. They don't use any electronic equipment, and they use dead drops instead of face-to-face meetings. Sarah continued. What matters is that Marcus Webb and his team have accomplished something remarkable. They've taken a population that had no concept of military strategy and taught them not just tactics, but philosophy. Look at these engagement patterns. She highlighted a section of the tactical display. The natives are winning fights against superior forces because they've been taught to value human life differently than you do. They're just primitives, the general insisted. They can't possibly. They were primitives, Sarah corrected. Now they're a trained militia with insurgent capabilities that would take most developed worlds months to organize. And they did it in 90 days with 4 advisors and determination. The princess moved closer to the display, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail. What is it about your species that creates this capacity for irregular warfare? Sarah considered the question carefully. Humans come from a world with harsh competition. We evolved on a planet with predators, limited resources, and multiple human societies constantly in conflict with each other. For the vast majority of our existence, we didn't have overwhelming technological advantages. We couldn't rely on superior force. We had to use intelligence, adaptation, and psychological understanding to survive. She highlighted more data. We spent millennia fighting enemies we couldn't overpower directly. We learned to see advantages in terrain, in supply lines, in the enemy's psychology. We learned that sometimes the best weapon isn't a bigger one. It's making your enemy believe they're fighting for something hopeless. Sarah stood up and gestured to a holographic globe of Kepler 7. Here's what I recommend. We don't fight these natives. We negotiate with them. Webb and his team have proven themselves to be strategic thinkers who understand human principles of warfare and honor. That's leverage. They've also shown they value the native population's lives. That's another lever. You're suggesting, the princess said slowly, that we surrender the mining colony? No, Sarah said. I'm suggesting we surrender the ideology of occupation. We renegotiate the mining agreement with the native leadership. We offer them percentage shares of the mining profits, proper compensation for land use, and genuine partnership in the operation. We validate their intelligence and their right to self-determination. The general sputtered with indignation. Valorians do not negotiate with primitives. We do not share power. Then you remain bogged down in a conflict that wastes resources and damages your reputation, Sarah said coldly. I've reviewed your intelligence. The natives aren't trying to destroy the colony for glory. They're trying to protect their homeland. Give them a voice in how that homeland is used, and they become stakeholders in the operation's success rather than enemies of it. The princess was silent for a long moment. Then she said, And Webb? The other 3 humans. Sarah smiled. Webb will negotiate on behalf of the natives. He's proven he can organize and motivate. That makes him valuable. We offer him a position as liaison between Valerian operations and the native leadership. Same for his team. They become official advisors on peaceful integration protocols. You're suggesting we hire the very individuals who have been attacking us, the general said incredulously. I'm suggesting you recognize that in this situation, your enemy understood something you didn't, Sarah replied. And the cost of learning that lesson the hard way is higher than the cost of learning it the easy way. Hire them. Use their knowledge. Or keep bleeding soldiers while fighting a war you can't win. The princess walked to the viewport and gazed down at the planet below. How did you arrive at this strategy so quickly, she asked. Your analysis, your conclusions, all of it came within hours of reviewing the data. Because I've fought this kind of war before, Sarah said. Humans have fought this kind of war for centuries. Insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, proxy conflicts where technology matters less than understanding human motivation and behavior. I recognize the patterns immediately because they're in our history books. Your species has never experienced this. You've conquered through force and maintained control through technological superiority. You've never had to understand an opponent who refuses to play by those rules. The princess turned back to face Sarah, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in her eyes, only a cold, calculating respect. 3 months of military failures, and a human solves it in an afternoon by understanding something we never considered. Not never considered, Sarah said carefully. Humans understand something that took you this long to learn. That victory isn't always about winning battles. Sometimes it's about winning hearts and minds. That's the real power humans bring to warfare. The princess nodded slowly. Prepare a negotiation team. Use Webb as the initial contact. Let's see if your philosophy works better than our weapons. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Valerian flagship as the representatives from the native population arrived for the formal agreement ceremony. The sight was both striking and absurd. Primitive beings in hand-woven garments walking alongside Valerian officials in their advanced technical suits, neither species quite comfortable with the other, yet both understanding the necessity of coexistence. Marcus Webb walked between them, his weathered face showing the strain of 3 months underground and the relief of seeing his strategy succeed. He was no longer a defector or an enemy combatant in the eyes of the Valorians. He had been officially appointed as Chief Liaison Officer for Human Valorian Asymmetric Operations, a title that made Sarah want to laugh, though she maintained her professional composure. The negotiation chambers were filled with historical significance, though the Valorians seemed unaware of it. Sarah recognized the exact moment when the native leadership understood that the Valorians were actually treating them as equals in this negotiation. It was a subtle shift in facial expressions, in posture, in the energy of the room. The war wasn't being won by force anymore. It was being resolved through respect. Princess Audria presided over the ceremony with the careful attention of a military commander learning to play diplomat. The terms were surprisingly generous by Valerian standards. The natives would receive 20% of all mining profits, would have representation in the decision-making process for mining operations, and would retain full autonomy over their cultural and governance structures. The Valerian mining operation would expand as planned, but with environmental protections and a commitment to minimal disruption to native settlements. It was compromise rather than conquest, collaboration instead of subjugation. For a species used to absolute dominion, it was revolutionary. As the ceremonial documents were signed, or rather, marked with native symbols and Valerian biometric authentication, Sarah observed the expression on the princess's face. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered now by something else. Calculation. Recognition. The early stirrings of respect. When the ceremony concluded, the princess approached Sarah privately on the observation deck, her guards discreetly withdrawn to maintain the appearance of confidentiality. In 3 weeks, there will be a gathering of the Valerian Military Council, the princess said without preamble. All the high commanders, all the sector governors, all the decision-makers within our civilization will attend. I want you there, Commander Chin. I want you to brief them on human combat philosophy. Sarah felt her officers tense slightly. This was a significant request, and potentially a dangerous one. Showing human military expertise to the entire Valerian power structure could either elevate human status or create a political problem that humanity wasn't prepared to handle. Why? Sarah asked simply. The princess turned to gaze at the planet below, where the native population was beginning to celebrate their newfound partnership with the Valerian mining operation. Because I made assumptions about your species based on limited information and what I believe to be obvious facts. I am not alone in this among my people. We have classified humanity as a species with interesting ingenuity but limited military capability. We have assumed that your relatively short lifespans and small population made you inherently inferior to us. She paused, her silver fingers gripping the viewport's edge. In the past 14 days, I have reviewed human military history in depth. I have studied your species' evolution, your conflicts, your strategies. Do you know what I discovered? Sarah remained silent, waiting. You have fought wars against opponents with technological superiority and won. You have created entire schools of military thought dedicated to understanding human psychology, to exploiting enemy weaknesses through understanding rather than through firepower. You have a concept called hearts and minds that I now recognize as foundational to actual military success. The princess finally turned to face Sarah directly. Most significantly, your species views victory as a complex concept rather than simple domination. You understand that you can win a battle and still lose a war. You understand that the goal of warfare should ultimately be to create a stable peace, not endless domination. Is that what you want for the Valerian Collective? Sarah asked. Stable peace instead of endless conquest. I want the Valerian Collective to survive and flourish for the next 10,000 years, the princess said carefully. Endless conquest eventually creates too many enemies, too many resentful populations, too many reasons for other species to unite against us. I witnessed that principle in action here on Kepler 7. The moment we stopped being conquerors and started being partners, the conflict evaporated. Sarah considered this. It was a profound shift in perspective from the arrogant creature she had met weeks earlier. The military council will resist this idea. They will, the princess agreed. Which is why I need you to present it to them. I need them to hear from a military professional, someone whose combat experience dwarfs most of our commanders, that there is a better way to conduct warfare. They need to understand that being Valerian doesn't mean being rigid in strategy. Over the following week, Sarah and her team prepared a comprehensive presentation on human military philosophy. They covered everything from ancient asymmetric conflicts to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. They analyzed victories won not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding. They presented case studies of how human forces had defeated enemies with technological advantages by understanding the psychological, logistical, and strategic principles that actually determined military outcomes. The gathering of the Valerian Military Council took place in a vast amphitheater carved into an asteroid that served as the military's headquarters. Thousands of commanders, governors, and tactical experts filled the space, all of them regarding Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Sarah stood before them with the confidence of someone who had stood before hostile crowds before. She began not with theory, but with practice. She walked them through the Kepler 7 scenario, showing them exactly how 4 humans had managed to stalemate an entire Valerian military operation through understanding their opponent rather than overwhelming them with force. The Valorians won every individual engagement on Kepler 7, she explained, her voice carrying through the amphitheater with perfect clarity. Your soldiers were better trained, better equipped, and more numerous. Yet you were losing the war. Do you know why? Because you were fighting against an enemy that had learned to fight like humans. And humans have spent millennia perfecting the art of victory against overwhelming odds. She showed them data, historical examples, tactical analyses. She demonstrated how human military philosophy had evolved through centuries of necessity and competition. And slowly, she felt the room's skepticism transforming into genuine interest. By the time she concluded her presentation, the amphitheater was silent. Then, from the front row, the supreme commander of the Valerian military forces stood. He was ancient by Valerian standards, his skin marked with decades of military service. "You suggest," he said slowly, "that we have been conducting warfare with only half of the knowledge necessary for true military superiority." "I suggest," Sarah replied, "that every species develops expertise in their own context. You developed superior technology and coordination. Humans developed understanding of motivation, adaptation, and psychological warfare. Combined, they create something neither species could achieve alone." The Supreme Commander nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps, Commander Chin, we have been asking the wrong questions about your species. Not, how many battles have you fought, but what can we learn from how you fight?" Sarah allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "That, Supreme Commander, is the right question." In the weeks that followed, the Valerian Collective began restructuring their military doctrine with unprecedented speed. Sarah and her team remained stationed with them as consultants, gradually introducing principles of asymmetric defense, psychological operations, and collaborative strategy building. Princess Audria was promoted to the position of Commander of Unified Valorian Allied Forces, a new division dedicated to coordinating with other species rather than simply conquering them. On the final day of her assignment, Sarah received a personal transmission from the princess. The message was simple: "You were right about humans. Not because you fight with unusual weapons, but because you understand that true military dominance comes from understanding your opponent, not destroying them. Thank you for teaching us what we should have learned centuries ago." Sarah smiled as she prepared her ship for departure. The Valorians had finally understood what humans had discovered long ago: that the most powerful weapon in any conflict was not superior force, but the wisdom to know when force was unnecessary. And that lesson, she hoped, would echo through the galaxy far longer than any battle ever could.